Well, this is just going to be a brief meta digression, but you're clearly not just an economist, but you're an historian of economics. And for my philosophical education, in my philosophical education, we're constantly looking back, even in writing contemporary papers, to Aristotle or Plato or medieval philosophers, because they were often thinking about the same questions that we're thinking about today. They had brilliant insights, and sometimes they were correct. But in the economics case, which I'm much less familiar with, why is it, or can you put your finger on why the history of economics, going all the way back to Babylonia in this case, and ale women, is so important to your theorizing about today's problems?
Well, once I began to study the balance of payments statistically for the Chase Manhattan Bank beginning in 1964 of third world countries. My question that they asked me was, how much money can Argentina, Brazil, and Chile afford to borrow from us? Can you tell us their ability to pay off the debts and how much debt service they can afford to pay? Well, I quickly found out that they were already at what seemed to be the limit of their debt service. Again, this was 1964, 65. It was obvious they were already pretty much loaned up. And the Federal Reserve and the government told Chase and other banks, well, don't worry, we'll lend them the money to pay you the interest. We're not going to let them go under because it's in America's interest that you lend them the money, so they will continue to remain in a U.S. Dollar-centered economic system. And the Commerce Department would publish through the Bureau of Economic Analysis the balance of payment statistics every 3 months in the Survey of Current Business. And Table 5 was their table of U.S. government role in the balance of payments. And they had a whole category for foreign aid in the form of aid to foreign countries for them to pay interest back to the U.S. Banks. So what I realized that much of the American foreign aid never involved a foreign currency at all. It was none of the money ever left the United States. The government wouldn't really send money to Brazil or Argentina or Chile to put in their currency, and then they'd change it back to pay the U.S. The money would be paid from the Treasury right into the New York banks that made most of the loans to these countries. So I saw that countries couldn't pay the debts that they owed. And after I left Chase and went on to work for Arthur Andersen and the Hudson Institute, by the late 1970s, I became the economist for Unitar and wrote three big articles for Unitar on third world debt, explaining why the southern countries couldn't repay the debt that they were on unless the United States government kept lending the money to these countries to pay the U.S. banks, growing exponentially. Well, Unitar had a meeting in Mexico around 1979 and 80. The president of Mexico wanted to become head of the United Nations and sponsored this meeting. And I gave my paper there explaining that there was going to be a debt crisis. This was in, I think, 79, 3 years before the Mexican default triggered the whole Latin American debt bomb. Well, there was a riot. And I realized that the idea of that debts couldn't be paid was unthinkable to most people. They couldn't imagine debts not being repaid. They could imagine the autumnal drain. They could imagine a business cycle of bankruptcy. They could imagine farmers not being able to pay periodically, but they couldn't imagine that the system itself was bound to collapse. So I got interested in the history of debt cancellations, and I began to write a history of them. And I was able to go back to Athens and advocacy in Rome, to Athens to Solon, canceling the agrarian debts to avoid a crisis in Athens. And I read the Bible and got back to the Jubilee year and came across isolated reports that there were Babylonian antecedents to all of this, that all of this had come earlier in the Near East. So I began to look and read whatever I could in the Near East. And I discussed my findings with a friend of mine, Alex Marshak, who was a specialist in Ice Age society and writing. And he introduced me to his chairman, Karl Lambert Karlowski at Harvard, who ran the Peabody Museum, which was Harvard's anthropology department, and they appointed me a research fellow in Babylonian archaeology. So I spent the next, 8 years studying everything I could in Babylonian, Sumerian, and I found out that there were many, many references to debt cancellations being regular in the ancient Near East. But if you looked in the index of books and articles, debt didn't appear. Debt cancellation didn't appear. It was just talked about in passing. So I had to read a huge amount. Well, finally, I convinced Harvard that this is really an important topic to find. How did debt begin? Why is it that when we have the first interest charges, society, the rulers decided, okay, we're going to have interest, but we know that there's going to be a collapse periodically. If you read Hammurabi's laws, he knew that there were going to be droughts or floods. So one of Hammurabi's laws said, when the storm god Adad hits, there's going to be a debt cancellation, and you don't have to pay the personal agrarian debts. Well, we decided to set up a series of professors to begin writing an economic history of the ancient Near East. How is it that almost all of the modern economic practices, weights and measures, the equivalent of coinage, metallic weighed pieces of metal that were used for money, account keeping, interest charges, contracts, all of these developed in the ancient Near East. But almost all of the histories look at Western civilization as beginning in Greece and Rome, and instead of much earlier in the ancient Near East. So we decided to do a series of publications of colloquia, and the first one was going to be on privatization in general, to discuss, well, what's the role of the palace and the state relative to the private sector? How is it that rulers were able to cancel the debts and there wasn't any opposition? Everybody acknowledged the need to cancel debts.